spoke about. It's a novel. So the first rule in talking about a novel is don't give away the story, don't give away the ending. But I will say that it is the story of the Aliyah. The Aliyah literally means the ascent in Hebrew. It is the return to the homeland of the diaspora Jews. Now, when one says return, it's already a bit ironic, because how do you return to a place you've never been to? But certainly, many of these Jews, even living 2,000 years in other lands, lived with a sense that they would one day return to the promised land. It's a very peculiar thing. I don't think genuinely that there is an equivalent in any other cultural or religious tradition. I cannot think of another equivalent. This is something extraordinary. And in fact, it's wonderful how at the beginning of the novel, a young 20-year-old character, Solomon, has a nightmare. The novel begins with a nightmare. And the nightmare is actually welcomed by his grandmother as signaling that he is accepting the idea of return to Israel. Now, the grandmother is born and brought up in Kerala. She is known as a Mutashi, and she is simply not from anywhere else. But she has carried with her this yearning to go to Israel. And her grandson, who is young and knows no other life, resists that until this moment of the nightmare. And it's quite fascinating what Sethu'S novel does. So he describes this Jewish community in a village. He described it so well in his own remarks. And how they start with the creation of Israel in 1948 and the appeal by the new government of Israel to Jews around the world to perform Aliyah, to come back to Israel. How people start going. But he captures all the dilemmas. So he has a couple of characters. There is a comrade. After all, this is Kerala. You can't not have a comrade. And a school teacher. So you've got both Varidi Master and comrade Pavitra, who asked the reasonable question. Why would you want to leave a place which is the only home you've ever known and where you have no problems, where you have been accepted so well? And this question goes to, in many ways, the heart of the Jewish experience in India. Basically, and I'm sure that Professor Skaria will tell you much more, I have been captivated by the whole story of the Jews of India, partly because of my passion for history, partially because of very close friendship with the Jewish family in Calcutta. And basically what you have is three waves of Jewish migration. Even that is a simplification because there are waves within the waves. But the broad three waves, the first one and the one we are most concerned with would be the Kerala Jews. Now, I think Sethu gave the more conservative estimate for when they came, but oral legend certainly had it that they came either on King Solomon's ships or they came with the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, or at the very latest by the destruction of the second temple by the Romans. And I think that at least a third of those stories has to be right, because in the Christian tradition, there is a lovely oral legend that when St. Thomas the Apostle, good old doubting Thomas of the Bible, landed on the shores of Kerala sometime around 52 AD, that he was greeted on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. So at least if you believe that oral legends have a place in our reconstructions of history, then you have to accept that the Jews were established in Kerala before 52 AD. Now, we can have arguments, I have had a few arguments with my Hindutva friends, but the truth is that I think given our paucity of written records, in fact the first real written record of Jewish presence is 1,000 years later in copper plate inscriptions given to Joseph Rabban, granting him certain lands in about 1000 AD, 11th century. Given the paucity of written inscriptions, we really do have to rely a little bit on oral history. But anyway, that's the first wave, the Jews of Kerala. And even there were sort of three kinds of Jews. There are the so-called black Jews, who were maybe in the early years assimilated or whatever with the local people and were considered darker, though this is a highly contestable description. Then there are the so-called white Jews or the Pardeshis. They, it is said, migrated a bit later from, not from Palestine, but from Europe, from southern Spain. So they actually don't come before St. Thomas. They come around the 4th or 5th century. And then there are the, the Mishwararim, I think, again Professor Scaria will tell you more, who were the offspring of miscegenation. That is, people, usually the so-called white Jews who slept with Indian women here and had children who were noticeably darker than the others. So this was the community, but all three put together were only about 2,500 people at their peak, so it was a small community. A larger community is the Bene Israel up in the hinterland of Bombay, Maharashtra. Now there is absolutely no record of when they arrived. In fact, everything we know about the Bene Israel's early days is pure surmise. Could have been 4th, 5th century, as Sethu'S said, because they could have come around the same time as the Pardeshis from Mallorca. But whatever it was, they were happily accepted, they were allowed to remain. No one knew who and what they were. They were treated like another subcaste. They had some peculiar habits, and they had the Star of David and the skull cap. But it took a wandering Jewish rabbi in the 9th or 10th century to recognize them as Jewish and give them the name the Bene Israel, or children of Israel. So that is the second major wave. And the third wave came still later. And in India we call them the Baghdadi Jews, but they came from a lot of Middle Eastern capitals, from the Ottoman Empire, from Baghdad, from Damascus, from Aleppo, even as far east as Alexandria, they all came. And they came principally during the British Empire and settled in the big cities of the British Raj, all the way up to Singapore. So these were the three waves, and these people, of course, in the British Raj became the most prosperous and most enlightened of the Jewish people, because they were very quickly able to see advantages in assimilating with the white British masters. And the Brits accepted them as such, and they succeeded in many ways. The Sassoon docks in Bombay, for example, by a Baghdadi Jew, created by a Baghdadi Jew. There were banks, there were stores, there were trading companies, there were stockbrokers. And my own friend Yael Silliman in Calcutta, her family was very much into stockbroking. She's written a lovely book of memoirs about 3 generations of Baghdadi Jews in Calcutta. And one very interesting thing for me, because I read her book and launched it in Delhi, was reading Sethu'S book. Because Sethu'S book is about people leaving, and her book, set more contemporaneously, is about the next generation coming back to discover the India of their ancestors, the Teak al-Myra. Anyway, so this is why I'm so captivated by all of this story. The Kochi Jews, as you know, are now dwindled. They're nowhere near 2,500. But don't forget that all these Jews put together were never more than 30,000 at their peak, and their peak would have been just before the creation of Israel. And that 30,000 in a country which at the time of our independence was about 300 million people. So the Jews were never more than 0.001% of the Indian population at their peak. And yet they've had such a terrific impact, and one of the most remarkable things in their story is that none of these 3 waves ever knew the slightest persecution on Indian soil. They are the only Jewish diaspora in the world that did not know any persecution. The only cases of anti-Semitism in India were inflicted by the Portuguese when they showed up in the 16th century in pursuit at the time of the Great Inquisition, when they were, of course, on a rampage against the Jews. They did beat and torture a few Jews, but it was never Indians who did it. It was always the Portuguese. And of course, that's one of the reasons why some Jews left North Malabar and came down to Kochi and settled there. And to this day, as we all know, the Kochi synagogue remains one of the marvels of the global Jewish world. So there's a lot of history there. I shouldn't digress too much on history, because history is only one thread of Sethu'S book. Sethu'S book is about more than history. It's about love, about loyalty, about the pull of allegiance. Who do you feel allegiance to? To the country where you have lived, where your parents have lived, where your grandparents have lived, where you have all your friendships, your businesses, your thriving lives, where you have always had acceptance, the country whose language you speak, whose clothes you wear. Is that where you should have allegiance? Or is it to some remembered dream of your ancestors now calling you back? Well, we all know they chose the latter. And I think it's very interesting to go through the welter of emotions that Sethu'S characters have to go through in order to come up to that conclusion. And not everyone makes the same conclusion. I don't want to spoil the book for you, but it is fascinating. In fact, Sethu told me a very interesting story outside while we were talking, which I thought he would repeat here, but he didn't. So let me tell you that story for him. It's about a gentleman he knows, an 84-year-old man who visits from Israel regularly, having left here as a young boy 60 years ago, or almost 70 years ago, I suppose. And when he came and chose to build a gorgeous house in the village, on the very site where his ancestors used to have a home, Sethu says he asked him, why are you doing this? There's nobody left here, nobody in your family, you hardly come, you're getting old. Who is this house for? And he said, I have to preserve this house because the bones of mine, says, my ancestors are sleeping under this soil. So you can see that allegiance and loyalty tug in both ways. And I think the book has a terrific lesson for all of us who think about these issues. It is also clashes of tradition and modernity, clashes of love and loyalty, clashes of various sorts, and emotions beautifully described. And there's a generational conflict as well that's very well evoked. So there's a lot there in the book. I want to commend Sethu for writing it and writing it so evocatively. I want to congratulate the translator for the work she has done in making this book so accessible to a non-Malayalam reading audience. I haven't read the saga of Muziris. I'm delighted that Sethu has rewarded me for my presence with a copy. I look forward to reading it. But I think that we don't do enough fictional writing about our historical traditions. I think what Sethu has done is an invaluable contribution, not just to the world of literature, but to the recapturing of memory. He grew up in such a village. He's seen it in his own childhood. If he hadn't written this novel, we as a civilization would have been denied a terrifically important part of our patrimony. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to launch this book here, is because I think Indian literature and Indian culture and heritage are enriched by the existence of a book like this, and by the fact that such themes speak to the India that Sethu described in his remarks, the India we all cherish, and India where people of every faith can. He mentioned the hillock and the four faiths. I often like to tell the story of the 71 war, when the Pakistanis rather foolishly declared a jihad against the Hindu infidel and discovered they're being faced by an army led by a Parsi, a northern sector air force commanded by a Muslim, Air Marshal Latif, the eastern sector GOC&C was General Jasjit Singh Arora, a Sikh, and the general helicopter into Dhaka to negotiate the surrender of the Pakistani troops was Jewish, Major General Jacob. That is India, that's the India we all cherish, and I want to congratulate Sethu for having evoked that India so brilliantly for all of us.